Hello and welcome. My name is Brad Cloza. I'm the program director of the Future Networks Initiative at IEEE. If you're not familiar with IEEE, we are the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. Before we begin, I just want to explain the format of this live event. Our panelists will speak for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll then look to the questions that were left in the comments section, and we'll pick some questions from the audience and get through as many of them as we can before we have to close down. So feel free to submit any questions you might have for them in the comments field. And now we can begin. This is the second in a 4-part series for LinkedIn Live called 5G Demystified. This is a special collaboration between IEEE Future Networks and IEEE Educational Activities. And today's event is called Broadband is Infrastructure, with a question mark at the end there. Our expert panelists are going to discuss this somewhat new concept that internet access has taken its place alongside roads, bridges, and utilities as a new kind of infrastructure in the purview of governments. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed a major flaw in global infrastructure when it turned out that millions, if not billions, of people were unable to work or attend school from home due to lack of reliable connections to the internet. So what can we expect with so much government effort and funding going into broadband? At this time, I'm going to hand it over to David Witkowski, who will lead us as the moderator through this panel and introduce our guests.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's part of this. Welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about this topic, which is, I'm sure, of interest to a lot of people. Coming out of the pandemic, I think the pandemic didn't create the digital divide, but it certainly exposed many of us to its realities and the impact that broadband has on our daily life. Prior to this, I think digital divide was something that we knew existed, and it was unfortunate, but it didn't impact most people, and so it wasn't something that we put a lot of thought into, or at least many of us didn't put a lot of thought, although I think a lot of our panelists today did put a lot of thought into it. And now that the pandemic is beginning to wind down, we're beginning to see the aftermath of that. As most people in the world's population entered their homes in mid-March of 2020, I think many didn't realize that they would emerge months later with a newfound appreciation for how critical this service is to our daily life in the 21st century. And so to address this issue, policymakers across the world have begun looking at broadband as infrastructure, as making it just as important as roads and waterways and sewers and pipes and all the things that we rely on in the course of our daily non-digital lives. And so in the United States, particularly, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or sometimes just known as the Infrastructure Bill, which included an unprecedented $65 billion for broadband expansion and extension across the United States and its territories. It includes funding for Native American tribal projects. It includes the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is there to help offset the costs of access for families in need. It includes the Middle Mile Connectivity Opportunity Funding System, which just recently went through application and is now in review. And then there is the last mile connectivity funding opportunity, which will come later when the Federal Communications Commission ratifies its broadband maps, which by law are necessary in order to move the last mile program forward. The Infrastructure Act and the funds for broadband are administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, or administration, I should say. And combined with many state-level funding programs, I really see that this represents a generational opportunity for the United States to modernize and extend our networks, given the size and scope of this program and the funding associated with it. There's a huge amount of interest from public agencies, private companies, nonprofits, and of course, lots of consultants who all have great ideas on how to make this work. Experts who were previously affiliated with organizations like the Marconi Society and the California Emerging Technology Fund have been called up and are now working for the NTIA on these programs. So it's interesting when we think about how many people who are involved in digital inclusion are now working for NTIA. I think we'll talk about that during today's panel. And so today we're going to discuss the Infrastructure Act. We're going to examine how these programs might play out in the months and years ahead. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce quickly our panelists. Starting in no particular order, Paul Garnett has more than 25 years of experience in telecommunications and technology, law and policy, market development, and business development. Prior to founding the Vernonberg Group, a consulting company focused on encouraging projects and businesses that bridge the digital divide, Paul created and led Microsoft's Airband initiatives, which many of you may be familiar with, leveraging a partner-driven approach to extending broadband access to unserved communities in the US and globally. Amy Huffman is Policy Director at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. She also served as the state of North Carolina's first digital inclusion and policy manager for the Broadband Infrastructure Office. And we're going to talk today about the role of state broadband offices in these programs. And she led the office's design of digital inclusion programs, policies, and tools to build the state's digital equity ecosystem. And last but not least, Alex Wiglinski is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I hope you appreciate I pronounced Worcester correctly, Alex. He is an internationally recognized expert in wireless communications, cognitive radio, spectrum coexistence, 5G and 6G, connected vehicles, software-defined radio, dynamic spectrum access, satellite communications, and vehicular technology. Alex is also director of the Worcester Polytechnic Institute's Wireless Innovation Laboratory, or WILAB. So good morning and good afternoon to all the panelists. Let's just go straight into it. I think that it's important to sort of start, as Simon Sinek says, we should start with why. So let's talk about why this program exists. What is the intention of the broadband portions of the Infrastructure Act, and how are the various programs implemented? And I'm going to start off with Amy, since you worked at the state broadband office, and you're part of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. So please tell us the intentions here and where is this coming from?
Thank you, David. And thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today with these esteemed colleagues. So a big part of the why was preempted by COVID, right? As you said in your intro, the digital divide is not new. Both Alex, Paul, and I have been working on this for some time. If you combined all of it, it would be decades. And yet COVID really did just tear open the spotlight on the issue. And so in response to that, Congress passed several pieces of legislation that were intended to respond to it. The Infrastructure Act, they took a different approach, actually. It wasn't a response. It's not meant to be a Band-Aid approach. It is meant to set up new systems that completely and holistically address all the different facets of the digital divide, and therefore set us up for if future digital divides or future pandemics or future instances happen where people were all home again or things like that, that there will be systems in place to make sure that everyone's covered. And they also recognized in the Infrastructure Act that there are not only multiple pieces and multiple facets that need to be addressed, but that states have a really important role to play in supporting broadband infrastructure and deployment, and also in digital equity. And so you see that through both the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program and the Digital Equity Act program, that the federal government has given states a lot of authority and responsibility to lead the way in closing the digital divide in their individual states and territories.
Thank you, Amy. Paul, you have thoughts on the intentions here, and you've seen this more from the commercial side. So
yeah, I mean, so I think, as Amy said, the COVID-19 pandemic definitely shined a more intense spotlight on the whole issue of the digital divide, and so I don't think anyone would disagree now that having access to the internet over a high-speed connection is important, and not just on a mobile device, but also a fixed device, so or fixed connectivity in the home. So home broadband access, became all the more important during the COVID-19 pandemic with, work from home and learn from home and get access to doctors from home and all that. And if you look at, at the U.S. overall, you look at the numbers, basically between 2 and, let's say, 12% of U.S. households don't have access to broadband as it's defined by the Federal Communications Commission, 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. And then if you look at, and that's, and the infrastructure bill calls that unserved, right? And then if you look at the underserved, which are folks who don't have access to 100 megabit per second down and 20 up, that's let's say between 10 and 20% of households, depending on whose numbers you believe. So that's the group of people who couldn't get broadband access, couldn't buy broadband connections at home, even if they wanted to buy them. And then there's a second related issue of adoption of technology, adoption of connectivity, people actually purchasing home broadband when it is available to them. And about, and this will vary by location and by state, but across the US, about a quarter of US households don't subscribe to broadband even when it's available to them. And there are definitely some differences among different demographics. So low income is going to tend to have a higher non-adoption rate than high income in the US. So those are those two issues are really the key: the availability issue challenge and the adoption challenge, and both of those are there are significant gaps there, and I think that's why we've been through rounds and rounds of legislation and funding opportunities for this over the last few years, and we will for the next half a decade in terms of its implementation. You're on mute, David.
A big red box around my thing says you're on mute. I think it's really interesting how you're right. I mean, even in places like the Silicon Valley, right? I lived in San Jose, California, where we had VDSL at 100, 120, ostensibly 120. It never really performed at that level, but even that was often not adopted. And some of that is cultural, right? I mean, just some of it's just understanding. City of San Jose has, when they brought on their digital inclusion lead, they actually hired Jill Bourne, who was the librarian from the City of San Jose in the library system. So she has been looking at digital inclusion, not just as do you have availability, but do you understand how to use? As a librarian, what you would expect that she would be focusing more on the adoption side of this, which I think has been really important for them. Alex, you see this from the academia standpoint, and you've also been involved in your local community in broadband. So talk to us a little bit about your perspective.
So thank you, David, and thank you for having me be part of this great panel with Amy and Paul. Happy to be here. So from my perspective, from the more technological standpoint, a lot of my initial work in this space has been focused initially with respect to the infrastructure reaching places that are like underserved and unserved. Not so much from an economic standpoint in terms of whether a household can afford broadband or not, but whether they're even they have the opportunity to have that in the first place, right? So one project that was sponsored by US Ignite, which was led by Missouri Science and Technology University in Rolla. So Casey Canfield, her and the rest of the team, we were sort of the technology arm of it. We were focusing on a test deployment of looking at different types of wireless technologies and so middle mile and last mile technologies that would be able to provide one town in Northwest Missouri with connectivity. And it was interesting because this town was only 60, 70 miles north of Kansas City, right, which is relatively well connected. And these folks, a lot of these people who actually commute to Kansas City, when they get home, they do these outstanding things. Like, for instance, they go through 3 cell phones worth of data plans in order to provide broadband for their entire house, or just connectivity for their house. Forget about broadband, right? And so we were like exploring, different types of technologies other than fiber, right? Because, we hear a lot about fiber this and fiber that. Fiber is great. Fiber is fantastic. You can't beat fiber in terms of amount of data. But what about other technologies that, some folks have looked at and say, oh, that wouldn't work or whatnot? Like, for instance, millimeter wave, right? Like, and I don't mean millimeter wave from a 5G definition. I mean millimeter wave from like, a point-to-point type of like
60 gigahertz, teragraph kind of stuff, right? Yeah.
60, 70 gigahertz, higher, where you can, sure, again, it's not terabits per second type of data traffic, but can you reach these communities? And then afterwards, from that, using other types of technologies like unlicensed LTE or unlicensed 5G technologies. So, I mean, the idea is, and I kind of think of like Dilbert whenever I'm like in a scenario where it's a difficult challenge, I usually think of Dilbert and I say, work smarter, not harder. How can we use the available wireless technologies that, over the last 20 years since the .com bust of 2001, there have been a lot of advances in terms of wireless technology, right? It's in the news constantly, 5G this, 5G that. But there are other technologies. Can we put them to use in order to provide connectivity to these folks, something cost effective where we don't have to here's another roll of fiber. Okay, that's all the funding we have. We have to wait until next. Something that's cost effective. And that also translates all the way down to the taxpayer and to these communities, right? But also like exposure here within closer to home, like Worcester, there's a lot of discussion about broadband connectivity, and that's more for economically challenged parts of the city where during COVID-19 a lot of them did not have access for remote education, right? They at the end of the day they got that broadband access through public libraries, right? And renting Wi-Fi 5G and 4G hotspots in order to do their homework, right? So in terms of infrastructure, folks are definitely looking at ways to creatively and cost effectively develop this type of infrastructure that can bring that broadband to these communities in the case of let's say rural communities, tribal lands, you name it. But also economically viable solutions for folks who might not be able to afford broadband, through things like fiber and such.
It's interesting you bring up the alternate technologies perspective. Recently, the IEEE hosted the 5G World Forum, and IEEE Future Networks, as the head of the deployment working group, we were part of that. And one of the things that we do during these events is we do cross-team interactions. So I had meetings with the IEEE Connecting the Unconnected, which I know, Paul, I think you're part of that, right? So I had a long conversation with Josef Knoll from the University of Oslo, and he was telling me how in in the Scandinavian countries, they're moving away from fiber towards wireless, and with the recognition that, at least in that area of the world, fiber is really, really hard to do. And we talked a little bit about in the pre panel, we talked a little bit about the idea of, for example, micro trenching in a place where you get hard frosts, right? City of Las Vegas, Nevada had some issues with micro trenching for the other reason, was that it gets really, really hot there and the glue melts and the fiber comes popping out of the ground like snakes, right? So people are driving down the road and wondering why there are loops sticking out of the roadway. So it's fiber is certainly performance-wise is a great technology, but it may not be the solution. And so I tend to I'm balancing that against what seems to be at the United States, which is a very fiber-focused perspective. And maybe we can make that work here, where we're in Scandinavian countries. It won't work, but it'll remain to be seen. So Amy, you talked about other funding opportunities, or rather the fact that this is just a continuation of efforts. So there was CARES, there was American Recovery, there have been other things. What other funding opportunities for broadband are in parallel with the Infrastructure Act and the BEAD and the middle mile and such like that?
Yeah, so I mean, so one reason that states were brought up as one of the, big components of the IIJA in order to give out funds is because many states actually already established state grant programs for last mile deployment. So many, can't name how many, but many states already have that. So state funding is already going towards this. I know in my home state of North Carolina, we have a program called the GREAT program. Louisiana has the Gumbo program, which wins for the best acronym, of course. And then there are other, many other states have programs that fund that last mile deployment. And then the federal funds that we saw throughout the pandemic in response to the pandemic, there are many. So you mentioned CARES, which was probably the first, and that provided some funding for different projects. Notably, one, I think about 100 million or 10 million went to the Institute for Museum and Library Services and went out through state libraries to fund digital inclusion programs. Then, of course, we had the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which provided funds to NTIA, and they stood up, I believe, 3 different programs with that. They had a broadband deployment program that was wildly oversubscribed. And then that's also where they set up the tribal connectivity program and the program for minority serving institutions to do digital inclusion and broadband deployment work across the country. And then there was the American Rescue Plan Act, which of course is the big one. So in that program, or in that act, we had the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program that was stood up, which was the first time that Congress stood up funds for low-income households to supplement their broadband bill, in addition to Lifeline, right? So there's $50. So they set up the program that's now the Affordable Connectivity Program, but at the time it was $50 a month. It was $3.2 billion for that program. And then there's the, in addition, the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which went out to both states and local governments. And they had a wide range of things that they could spend those monies on. But broadband was one of them. And digital inclusion was also an enumerated expense that they could spend those monies on as well. And then in addition to that, there's the capital project funds, which was a $10 billion set of funds that is for broadband deployment primarily. And those funds are going out now. We're seeing announcements pretty regularly, actually, about weekly. And states are, again, the intended applicant and recipient of that. And we're seeing states be awarded with those funds to set up new broadband deployment programs or to run those funds through existing programs like Louisiana's Gumbo program, right? And I believe applications are due pretty soon for that. And all of those programs were intended to be rapid response, get money out the door, and begin to solve these problems quickly, right? Whereas the Infrastructure Act is intended to be long-term, complete with very thorough planning processes on the front end that set up these long-term systemic changes.
So it's really interesting. Thank you. You talk about all these programs, and of course there's actually other programs which are potentially being considered right now. There's a bill in Congress which is called the Grid Broadband Act that would further add funding for broadband. And I think you recognized in the pre-panel that this was because we expect infrastructure to be oversubscribed, and it's going to be a small amount of what's necessary. I find one of the things that's interesting to me is how many different federal agencies are involved in broadband. Certainly the FCC is involved. The American Recovery Broadband element, as I recall, was correct me if I'm wrong, was administered by Treasury, which I thought was interesting, right? Why was Treasury administering a broadband program? USDA has always had a hand in this because they deal with rural So that the feeling is well, you talk to farmers who need broadband, so therefore, when you're talking about cows, you should also I'm going to make a telecom pun. You talk about cows, you should also talk about cows, right? Meaning the cells on wheels or broadband. So, and then now it looks like they're talking about having Department of Energy potentially administer the Grid Broadband Act, which would be further. So we could have a long discussion about federal agencies interacting, but I wondered, I wanted to ask Paul for your thoughts on this. Given the complexity of what we're talking about and the interlocking timelines, what are the potential challenges that come about from having this multi-agency, multi-administration approach, combined with the fact that states themselves have broadband? And I realize that's a huge question, but I know you're a big thinker on this topic, and I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so we've gone from this, we sort of transitioned from a world in which, basically broadband regulation, broadband funding was all done at the federal level, and even at the federal level was concentrated in really three different places: the FCC, USDA with RUS, and NTIA. To now adding into the mix Treasury. U.S. Department of Education got involved a little bit because they were sort of responsible for flowing money to states in the sort of early rounds of COVID legislation. And now you're mentioning the U.S. Department of Energy. And then obviously there's been a huge shift through all of this legislation, supplementing what some states had already done with their own money at a small scale, basically shifting all the dollars, that higher level of administration happening still at the federal level, oversight at the federal level, but shifting responsibility for developing and implementing and overseeing these programs at the state and local level. I mean, even at the local level. So I mean, going to state level is definitely a big change, but sending dollars directly in the case of local funding from ARPA to counties and local governments for them to use the dollars at their discretion for a lot of different purposes, including broadband. That's a huge change. So all of that adds significant complexity to the whole system. It introduces a whole new cast of players being involved in this. Results in a lot of variability that will happen at the state and local level on programming. Within the range. So a lot of need for collaboration happening across federal agencies as well as the state and local governments, and a lot of need to harmonize all the different programming across all those different jurisdictions, and a very complex oversight system that's going to have to be put in place to make sure everything is done right.
A lot of touch points, right? There's a lot of touch points there. You deal with counties and cities. I mean, how many counties and cities are there in the United States? And they all have to be interacted with directly.
Yeah.
And so
and I would say, like, NTIA, for example, does do a good job, and I know their life is going to get much more complicated, but they do a lot with state broadband offices today. Mm-hmm. And I think that they'll continue to play an important sort of, coordinator role, and Treasury has been doing the same thing with anything ARPA related. So, but it's getting complicated, definitely.
Yeah, and that leads to a question that I wanted to ask. I'm going to ask Alex, and then I'm going to ask Amy to comment on this one. Throughout the history of the United States, there's always been tension between the federal government and the states, right? There's a dynamic tension there that we resolve through various means and politics, but states' independence from the federal versus the federal government's attempts to kind of corral everyone into the direction of a United States, that leads to, I think, some potential tensions here. And since, Alex, you work at the local level in Massachusetts, so if you could comment on what Paul said about local funding going directly into counties and cities, and then if you want to comment on the states interaction, then that'd be great. But I'd like to hear from Amy also on the states question after you're done, because you work with the state broadband office. So I'm curious how this plays out at the tactical level when the money is coming in.
That's a good question. So not well, other than like, for instance, like the ones in Massachusetts, there's the Massachusetts Broadband Initiative, right? And they provide funding through sort of a proposal mechanism to, let's say, towns or regions of Massachusetts that do not have either sufficient broadband access or no broadband access whatsoever, right? Like a good example would be where MBI came into play was the town of Princeton, Massachusetts, which is a relatively difficult area to provide broadband connectivity, not to the extent of, like, let's say, the Scandinavian example, but almost as challenging because it's located relatively inland from the ocean. For one, it's on the slope of Mount Wachusett. Lots of pine trees and such close to the soil. You're not too far away from bedrock. So and the existing infrastructure that's there at the moment, like, let's say utility poles and the like, there are a lot of issues with that as well in terms of being able to install this infrastructure on them. But MBI was one of the primary mechanisms for providing the town of Princeton with enough of the funding in order to start implementing or rolling out a fiber network across town. Again, like, there are some other limitations in terms of, like, could you use other technologies like millimeter wave? A little bit challenging because line of sight will be very, very difficult. They've tried in the past other point-to-point wireless technologies, but again, the reliability was like, there were several issues with that, especially with respect to things like latency, which makes like two-way communications a big problem. But MBI in terms of a state resource has been trying to serve in that role, and then otherwise, like, for instance, in other, like in like, for instance, city of Worcester, for instance, I think they've been trying to leverage various sorts of federal funding. I forgot if it was from EDA or not, like Economic Development Administration or not. Forgot which round of funding, in order to start at least develop some like broadband connectivity across the city and the like, in order to provide, especially in economically challenged parts of the city, with that access. But in terms of like funding at the local and state level, those are like, it's primarily like MBI that's like kind of the big, like, sort of the big agency in town, and otherwise it's like usually federal sources that are leveraged.
Thank you. Great answers. Amy, how will the federal complexity, interagency, interadministration complexity potentially play out with the state, with the state interactions?
Yeah. So the federal government, there's, like you said, a lot of different agencies that work doing this. I do know that there is interagency collaboration coordination, and I believe there's even there's an interagency working group which is the federal government's recognition that they all need to be talking to each other if they're all going to be in the broadband game, which is good. And so in the spirit of that, we hope to see that continue, like that happen between the federal government and the states as well. I think the intention, though, of Congress was they recognize that states are a level closer to the people than the federal government, and that therefore states have a better understanding of the needs on the ground. And it is a smaller unit than, say, if you were going to fund all of the municipalities or counties and local governments across the country. That would get pretty difficult pretty quickly. So states and territories in the District of Columbia became the unit that the federal government determined was the closest to the ground, and then the most streamlined, that they could get funds out to the people, to make sure that this work is done that in a way that actually reflects the needs on the ground. And it gets particularly true when you get on the digital equity side of things, because there are certain things that are true across every state and territory. Affordability is a challenge, right? But how that affordability, or really lack of affordability, plays out in an individual's life is very nuanced. And so therefore the solutions to it should be nuanced. And so there's actually quite a bit of room for states to innovate in this area, in both the digital equity planning process that is about to kick off for many of the states, and in the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is also the planning process about to kick off. There's a ton of requirements, and some of them are, only Congress could have come up with them, that the states have to meet. But there's a lot of recognition and flexibility for them to tailor the things to meet the needs of their specific populations across their states. And so my hope is that will play out the way it was intended, right? That there's the metrics and the main things that and goals of the program, each of the various programs that the states will have to meet, but that they'll get to tailor it to the needs of their individual people. And so therefore it will hopefully play out well. Now, of course, everyone is building this plane while we're flying, right? And so I think we're going to see some hiccups and some turbulence along the way. It's not going to be perfect, I think. But my hope is that it will play out the way it was intended when Congress wrote it last year.
It's interesting you say that this, and Paul, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'd also give you a chance to comment on what Amy just said. Yeah. But I just wanted to recognize one thing that Amy said, which was that states have the ground truth, if you will, on how things work. I think, of course, that is it's a true statement, but it's also a broad statement in the sense that Rhode Island certainly has a great sense for what's going on in Rhode Island. In California, covering so much territory, so many different, ranging from urban coastal to deep middle of nowhere county of Inyo, place that has a population of 18,000 people, and 14,000 of them live in one town, right, spread over thousands of square miles. Understanding a large state, I think, is a challenge for many of these state broadband offices. So variably saying that I think that there should potentially be regional approaches here in bigger Western states, especially. Paul, you wanted to offer some comments, and I you had, in the prep call that we did, you talked a little bit about even like how different states are approaching things slightly differently. You also mentioned that there were questions about whether these state broadband offices even have the legislative authority to spend the money that's being sent their way. So could you talk about that?
Sure. I just wanted to first respond to the question earlier on sort of this tension between the states and the feds. And I suspect that as this plays out, we're going to see more of that. And I think there's the potential for some sort of classic blue state, red state kind of tension going on here. And in particular, if you look at the infrastructure bill implementation, the BEAD program notice of funding opportunity, there are a handful of areas where I could see some significant variability in terms of how it gets implemented, and the potential for some tension between the way a state broadband office might want to implement that program and what NTIA is asking them to do. And just to rattle off a few issues, one, like for example, fair labor practices. Some states may not be a big fan of writing that into their programming, or maybe not as aggressively as NTIA would want them to do. On pricing, this middle class affordability issue, does that require rate regulation? Does it not require rate regulation? How much discretion do you give to broadband providers when they get funding? Issues around municipal broadband, that's definitely been kind of an area of debate across the states. How much do we let cities and towns get into the broadband business? There are some states where that's not permitted, and yet the NTIA is basically telling the states they're not going to get funding if they don't allow for that option. Even issues like climate change, like climate resilience, is a part of the BEAD program, NOFO, that states are going to need to account for that, or require fund recipients to account for that in their planning. And then even in something like underrepresented groups, that obviously there are some underrepresented groups that are sort of well documented in terms of broadband gaps, some less so, and does that create some tension between the states and the feds? In terms of the legislative issues, yeah, definitely. I've worked with some state broadband offices where their legislatures have either given them or not given them authority to spend federal money on broadband, and have given them jurisdiction to do so. And so as new federal legislation gets signed into law and implemented, state legislatures, which don't meet all the time, and there's some states where the state legislature might meet maybe like 8 weeks out of the year, 6 weeks out of the year, and that's it. So
Right.
Are they going to be ready in the window that they all sit down and talk to each other and
Sure.
and give people authority able to do that? So that's definitely going to, and that's going to impact how this all gets rolled out and when, and in different states. So we're going to see I think we're going to see a lot of variability there.
And you're making the distinction between states that have like full-time legislatures, right?
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, there's even states that do. I mean, it's hard enough in states where you do have full-time legislatures, but there
Sure.
are some states where you don't, and they have
Right.
short windows when they all meet, and maybe it's once or twice a year they all get together for several weeks, and everything happens then. And yeah, so I think there's definitely some issues around that
Right.
we'll see.
Excellent. Thank you. So I want to time check a little bit here. We're about 42 minutes in, and we do want to leave time for Q&A. We have a question from the audience that I wanted to address, but I wanted to lead into that question by saying that certainly all of these programs are going to generate, I think, a lot of interest from technology providers who all want to be part of the solution. I know in particular there are some technology companies that I'm well aware of who have really benefited from, for example, CARES or American Recovery. We're one company in particular that I won't name has really sort of like risen from the ashes through these programs. That they've a lot of interest in their technology now. And but in general, what would your advice be as panelists? And I'm going to ask Alex to start. What would your advice be for technology companies, briefly, on how they should prepare? How should they be approaching these opportunities and getting their value proposition out so that people can potentially consider them as solutions for that sort of non-fiber, especially? What would you say?
So I would almost like it, in my mind. I'm almost thinking should be almost a little bit of a change of perspective in terms of who's asking the question. I would almost say, town and municipal and local governments and the communities themselves should be asking what are requirements, right, for in terms of the broadband connectivity we're seeking and the type of services, because I mean there are going to be there are numerous options out there in terms of broadband connectivity that are non-fiber, right? I think making educated decisions on what those options are and how does it satisfy what you need is really, really important. So for instance, the two big things that come to mind for me are always latency, right? Latency is death, right? It's and then the second thing is spectral coexistence, which a community might not care about too much until it becomes congested, right? That their network. And so you got to weigh those options, right? So often I've heard we'll just apply 5G and we'll be done with it. Well, sort of, but not quite, right? Because there are capacity caps in terms of everyone says, oh, I heard 5G is supposed to deliver this many hundreds of megabits per second, and it's supposed to reach me this far away, and
Sure.
It's conveniently connecting all my devices. But additional homework into that will reveal how about in a municipality of, let's say, several thousand people? Will a cell phone base station be able to, a 5G base station be able to provide that connectivity for that many users, especially if they're 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away, right? So think the main thing is, like, I'm sorry if I twisted the question a bit, but I think it's really important.
It's a fair twist. I mean, I think what you're saying is that these have to be engineered solutions that are tuned to the local environment.
It's not a patch. It's not something like saying, bloop, we'll just put this in place because we told this would be the elixir that solves all ills, right? It's and sometimes it's like what might work in one community might definitely not work in another community, right? So I think and there are a lot of trade-offs. So we have things like satellite solutions, broadband sided solutions, but then you have to look at, definitely in that case, spectral coexistence and latency, right? Because SATCOM has a non-negligible latency, which means it's like, hey, David, can you hear me? And all of a sudden, here's this awkward silence, and then you respond to me. It's that affects the experience of broadband. 5G has its pros and cons. Millimeter wave has pros and cons. All these different solutions. So I'll just stop there. But it's like the communities need to be educated, need to do their homework. The policymakers, all of them. So, anyways.
So if I'm going to summarize what you've said, and I'm going to go to you next, Paul, and I'm going to give Amy the last word on this question. The technology companies should really be asking themselves, who are the local jurisdictions that are most suited for what we think are the capabilities of our technology, and they should be approaching those municipalities, those jurisdictions directly, asking for engagement, and then hopefully when the applications go in, that technology would then be included in the design, is what you're saying. Paul, do you agree with that? Is there a twist? Is there a twist to what Alex has said?
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. I mean, I think first of all, there's a lot of sort of perception out there that all the funding is meant for fiber networks, and of course, if I'm anyone in the fiber industry, I'm thrilled with what's been happening. But if you look at the legislation and look at the funding opportunity, NOFOs or funding opportunity announcements or whatever the document is that comes out of the relevant federal agency, there's nothing in there that says that everything has to be spent on fiber. And in fact, if you look at like the BEAD Act, the BEAD NOFO or the Treasury NOFO, it basically says, no, there's certainly a preference for fiber as long as it's feasible. And and we know it's not feasible everywhere. So the first thing I would say to the states and the cities and towns is you have far more discretion than you've been told, and primarily by the fiber industry lobby, who of course want everything to be spent on their technologies. I think the second thing is on advocacy. I think for those technology companies that are sort of feeling on the outs, like a lot of terrestrial fixed wireless technology companies of all the different flavors that are out there, satellite, even companies that do kind of hybrid fiber coax, fiber fixed wireless networks. All those companies all need to get together and go talk to the state broadband offices and explain to them, first of all, what the law allows and what it requires, but also what their technologies are actually capable of. Because I think a lot of state broadband offices as well, and especially at the local level, have all been led to believe that anything that's not fiber is useless and won't be useful for anything. So I think there's got to be some, and this is the moment for advocacy right now, because this is when states are all coming up with their 5-year plans.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the funding itself, I mean, there will be opportunities for tech companies to go directly to funders, as in like state and local governments. But for the most part, the dollars are going to be going to internet service providers or community-based organizations, not for profits. So as a technology company, you really need to be forging those partnerships with those kinds of organizations on the sets of solutions that will have the biggest impact in the communities where they are operating, so that they will include that, what you have to offer in their applications. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Great comments. Amy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just, I'll double down on what Alex and Paul said about doing this in partnership with community. So instead of allowing the technology to shape the community, allow the community to shape the technology.
Right.
There's listening to the folks on the ground who live in the digital divide every day will provide input into what is needed in their households, right? So this is what we're advising states to do. And while they're creating their digital equity plans, we're advising them to do that as they create their broadband equity access and deployment plans. And that's actually a big requirement in both of the NOFOs to talk to the community, to learn about what they need. And so I'd advise the companies to do the exact same thing, right? This isn't about telling people what they need. It's about listening to them about what they need and designing solutions based on that, that are affordable, right? Like we can put all the pipes and wires we want in the ground, but if it's not affordable, it's not going to do anyone any good. So just making sure that affordability is built into the economic model, as well as anything else that might be needed for the community members.
Yeah, I agree with that. I certainly, I think there, so summarizing all comments, I think one thing that I have seen has been that there is definitely a sense in many of these, like at the Public Utilities Commission level, there's like fiber, right? Okay, fiber's the solution. Well, yeah, maybe, right? Maybe not, depending upon terrain, depending upon things. I mean, I think one of the things that worries me about fiber as an fiber uber alles strategy is that you look at the amount of environmental mitigation you have to do in some locations to do that. Just in my local area where I live and where my company's headquarters are, we have an endangered salamander in this area that must be protected. And when you look at a planning or zoning document for even a simple project like putting up a new cell tower, 17 pages of that is what to do if you find a salamander. Now imagine that you're not just doing a square on the ground, but you're trenching along or boring along every highway in the state of California, which is sort of California's strategy has been to effectively say roads go to people, therefore we're going to build broadband along the roads. So they're partnering heavily with Caltrans in my state. And that's fine, but how do you mitigate all of the protected species that are you might encounter in the course of doing 10,000 miles of roadway? And certainly there are policies and procedures in place to do that, but it does lend itself to the notion that maybe fiber is not always going to be the solution. Because if you do find an endangered species or an archaeological site, Native American site, what do? You have to go around it. It'd be like that scene in the movie where the freeway is going down the road and all of a sudden there's a house and everyone has to make a kind of a loop around this house because the guy didn't want to sell his house, right? So I want to switch to Q&A because we got about 7 minutes left. A question popped up actually from Richard Barnhart, who I know. Hello, Richard. Thanks for being here. He asked the question, can somebody address the role of Starlink in closing the digital divide? And so I'd put it to the panel. Do any of you want to comment on Starlink's role? What is, Alex, you talked a little bit about satellite. So there's latency. There's also capacity, right? And then serviceability, because there's truck rolls to orbit are expensive, if not impossible. So what are your thoughts on Starlink? And then I'll go around, let everyone else have a comment.
I think you already answered it. No, but in all seriousness, but I think the thing is that I remembered, shucks, how many years ago was it? In 2009, I attended a conference in Germany, in Hanover, and the keynote was given by Joe Maitola, who was at MITRE, and he's like, the big name in terms of he was the guy who coined cognitive radio, the term. He has like a wildly downloaded dissertation from KTH in Stockholm, Sweden, and I remember that was his idea. Like at the time, no one believed it, about having satellites to cover the broadband needs of the country, mainly because of even though doing service calls in space is kind of expensive, and just getting that infrastructure into orbit and all that jazz. And don't forget about it being rad hardened, right? Because if there's solar flow activity, that's going to be a huge problem. There's a reason why they rad harden a lot of these satellite and space platforms, right? But the one nice thing about it is that in terms of line of sight, unless you live in a cavern or a cave or something, it does have that wonderful advantage. But suppose you don't care about video conferencing. Suppose you don't care about like anything that requires real-time interactive bidirectional communications. Satellite's actually a very nice option, right? Like imagine you do a lot of downloading or a lot of uploading and it's not real time. Well, you got all that bandwidth. You got all as long as it doesn't require any sort of interactive communications. But in other scenarios, like let's say you have a community that does a lot of work from home or telemed or anything like that, that could be a big problem, right? So, but there are other options that are available that could fill that gap.
And I think ultimately it's you take a toolkit approach and you use different technologies and different business models depending on where you're deploying and who you're trying to reach. And I don't think there's any question that there's so much money and effort behind it that Starlink is, Starlink already has, 1 to 200,000 customers on their constellation today that they're basically, piloting with, and it's been really successful so far. And they're planning to launch, something like 30,000 more satellites than they already have authority to do. So this is going to become a real deal, and other companies are also looking to do similar things in the satellite space. So I think definitely satellite will have a low Earth orbit satellite will have a role to play in low population density areas where terrestrial networks cannot be deployed for technical or economic reasons.
On Starlink.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about Starlink is at this point in time, the hardware cost is a pretty hefty fee. I believe it might be around $600 to get installed in a home. And then the service is on average about $100, $110 a month. So it's pretty unaffordable for many families at this point in time. So I like to keep that in mind when we're talking about different solutions. But, I know some families in North Carolina, there was a pilot program with Starlink, and they were very excited to get it because there was literally no other option. And so I agree with Paul in that this is a toolkit approach. I would like us, though, as we're thinking about setting up these systems and going through this long planning process through the BEAD program and the Digital Equity Act program, to really be thinking about the needs that we have 5+ years from now, right? So will Starlink still be able to provide the bandwidth and the need and the capacity that everyone needs in 5 years? So I would like states to go through that exercise, right? As they're setting up these programs, they're thinking about the long-term future, not a short-term.
Yeah, in my experience of having at one time considered a career in satellite broadband, when I applied to work at Aloha Networks back in the late 90s, and of course, at the time, the thought was that would be viable. But we've never really seen satellite work to the level that we thought that it would. There's always those physical realities, those engineering realities always crop in, right? So uplink congestion, latency, and certainly we've seen that we've seen that in Starlink, right? We've seen that. They recently were removed from the RDOF program because they were not performing at the level that the government wanted them to perform. So I think as we summarize here, and I see Brad coming on, he's going to get the shepherd's crook out. I think satellite is a solution potentially, but it is not the solution for a variety of reasons. And certainly it's not going to be the one technology to rule them all that makes everything better for the rest of eternity. Thank you all. I just want to say thank you to the audience, and thank you to the panelists. Today was a great discussion. Really appreciated the opportunity to do this. Brad is going to play us off the stage, and he'll give you some information about the webinar series that we're doing. But I really appreciate your contributions. Thank you for being here today and taking time.
And thank you, David. I appreciate it. And of course, to all the audience and our panelists, it was a really interesting discussion. And I look forward to doing 2 more of these. If you want to Tune into our next 5G Demystified panel. Just look in the description below the video field that you're watching right now, and you'll see a link for the next one, which is called Health and Safety of 5G, a topic that has always been of keen interest to a lot of people. That one will go live here on LinkedIn on November 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Just subscribe to that upcoming event, and you should get a notification from LinkedIn when just before we go live. And if you want to learn more about 5G and how it could transform industry and society, please visit the Future Networks Initiative website. It's futurenetworks.ieee.org. And that's all. Thanks, and have a great day. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.